1 year after the smash hit A Christmas Carol came out, a legendary Charles Dickens comes out with this guy, the Chimes, which we're going to talk about today.
The poor man's... No, this is the Hallmark version of Christmas Carol. I'm being mean, I know.
Dude, that is super mean, especially when the story talks about how being poor isn't necessarily being like lower on status. Like, whoa, harsh opener.
You see what I did there?
Yeah. Well, okay, let's just put it on the table right away. This is sold today. I mean, we're over, a century plus later, in this like collection of 5 Christmas stories from Charles Dickens. It's not totally a Christmas story, but it's got Christmas vibes. Like it takes over New Year's Eve to New Year's Day, but I guess there's a lot of similarities you could say in Rebirth, the chance for new opportunity. And to your point, there is a lot of similarities to A Christmas Carol, but I don't know, there's a bunch of Christmas stories that have similarities to each other, to be fair.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably 2 true different Christmas stories. They all retell each other. This just has so much a vibe of Christmas Carol to it because it's the same author. I mean, the way that the landscape is described, you know that Christmas just happened, so it's like Christmas adjacent. So no, it's not a true Christmas story, but it's Christmas themed.
Well, I'll say this. I do like the charm of that central church, the draw of the chimes, everybody's attention coming to it, and even how the chapters are broken up by chimes. You know, if you look at Christmas Carol, it's broken off by staves. We did the Cricket and the Hearth, broken up by chirps. There's something to be said about how, you know, have we ever talked about this? Have you been through Europe before?
Yeah, several years ago, my wife and I took a nice little trip through Europe. We started off in Portugal and then worked our way up through Spain, France, over down through, where do we go? Switzerland, and then into Italy, and about halfway down. We didn't make it to Rome.
Oh, okay. So you went like a huge trek then. You did get over.
Yes.
So then you know the idea about how, like, not all, but like a lot of European cities, like they have like this central focal point of like the church. It's almost like everything's drawn to the church, and up in the bell tower and the chimes, like, you know, you heard those bells. It was like a haunting presence. Like you knew what time it was when you were in town because like those chimes reminded you.
I think this story does a great job of the uniqueness of it. I mean, that's one thing that is, I know we joke and, you know, there's a lot of skepticism, ridicule, review on that it was, you know, Dickens trying to prove himself, that he was more than just a one-hit wonder of A Christmas Carol. And while the core idea may be the same, it is a very unique story. And I think it is kind of that central idea of the church and what it means to this one man and what lengths he will go to for his family.
Yeah. Well, the one man, okay, so Toby Veck, Trotty, a.k.a. he trots around town. He's a porter, a.k.a. a messenger, delivering information, news, tasks, stuff like that around town. I don't actually know what, I mean, porters have been long gone, so a lot of times when I talk about porters, I don't know what a porter is because I have never seen one because they're not really a job anymore. It's kind of like this callback to the past, you know what I mean? Like when you go to the cobbler shop and get your shoes fixed up and stuff like that. There's something charming, though, about a man who, like if we look at this as an ecosystem of a town, his job is running information between everyone, right? So he should be running information from the rich to the poor, to the transients, the women, the men, the aldermen. Like he sees it all, right? So at the focal point, we have Trotty. And what kind of a man would you say he is? Like in order to get like a good view into this town, you'd think he ought to be somewhat neutral, somewhat open.
I think he obviously lives a very simple life. I also think that he's a very humble person. I think he knows his place, or he's trying to find his place. And then as the story progresses, he kind of starts questioning his place in society and in his family. And that's broken down. And I think that hurts him because he thought he was doing the best he could, the best he should, what he was given. And I think that Trotty's hilarious. I am, and we learn eventually that he's older. I didn't realize that he was as old as he was. I thought he was going to be like in his 20s, 30s, sprinting around with the little, letters and stuff that are embossed with wax and everything. This dude's like 65 years old and he's still trucking around town like a pro, handing these snooty rich dudes letters around. I'm like, you go, guy. Like, this guy's busting butt for his family. And then these like rich guys come in and it's like, it's kind of heartbreaking. But I think Trotty is a good person deep down.
Mm-hmm. I think he's impressionable, right? I think he takes information from the outside world and absorbs it in some ways. But other times he rejects it too, right? Like they talked about how everybody kind of had the story of the haunted chimes and he didn't quite believe it. Right? Like what he hears the wind howl through the church and stuff like that. He's a little complicated with what he decides to be and not be. You know what I mean? But I view him as somewhat neutral, but unlike Scrooge from A Christmas Carol, he's poor. Like this man is broke. That he's definitely going to have, I think, more relations on that side of the socioeconomic scale.
And that's where, for me, kind of one of the key components of the whole story comes together is like, all right, so Dickens is trying to put an impression of economics with not Christmas so much, but what does it mean to someone? And we're right at the cusp of a new year. That's, a new beginning for a lot of people. Is this a turning point for Trotty? Is it a turning point as we get introduced to his daughter and his would maybe be son-in-law? Are these turning points for his family in a more positive note? And then we get introduced to kind of like the villains of the story of the, men with the top hats and the, snooties.
Right. Like first you meet like the poor and then you meet the rich, right? It's like we want to play the contrasting game as a reader, right? And the way Trotty reflects upon this was actually one of the more powerful lines to me in the story. He says, "And I can't make out whether we have any business on the face of the earth or not. Sometimes I think we must have a little, and sometimes I think we must be intruding. I get so puzzled sometimes that I am not even able to make up my mind whether there is any good in us at all, or whether we are born bad. We seem to be dreadful things. We seem to give a deal of trouble. We are always being complained of and guarded against. One way or other, we fill the papers. Talk of a new year," said Toby mournfully. So for me, this is kind of like approaching antinatalism territory, right? Like, should we really be born? Are we evil creatures that it is actually ethically wrong to bring more people into an evil world than not? Like, it's not exactly that conversation, but it's close to say, are we born evil, or does poverty make us evil? Does all this destitute influence us to become evil? And how do we strive to be better is really a very philosophical question, I think, from our boy Charlie Dickens here.
Definitely. And it gets to that point where I think about it of your circumstance, right? Are you born a certain way or are you molded a certain way? And the idea that, money corrupts. And if you are poor, are you innately good or are you innately bad? Are you rich? Are you innately good or are you innately bad? Or are your circumstances that make you who you are? And Trotty's struggling with that. I don't know if he struggled with that before it was pointed out to him, though. Does he internalize that because of what he sees in life of others? Or is it when the other gentlemen are introduced in the story that he starts questioning that? Because I hope anyway, that we're all born with somewhat goodness in us and the bad has to be pointed out. And I think that for me, that's what the story was hinting towards, is that once the bad is pointed out, that the crack in your goodness armor has implemented itself. And that's when you're going to start questioning everything.
Now, this is going to be a little bit more of a modern concept than what, I don't think it was around back in Dickens's time, but have you ever heard of like labeling theory?
I think we've talked about it briefly in a couple of other videos.
It's this theory that poverty And being labeled as such can like those attributes influence you to behave a certain way. So it's like if you're told, oh, you're poor, so therefore you're probably going to steal stuff. Well, then you might be like, oh, should I be stealing stuff? Like, it's not exactly that. And again, don't take me as the scientific definition. I'll put that up on the screen more so. But it's these aldermen cute and the rich people come out and like, oh, you aren't thinking about getting married, are you? Like, oh, that's something that's just going to cause more unhappiness. And then you see how Meg starts to think like later on in the story, like, oh, maybe I shouldn't get married. And you start to see Trotty start to think like, oh, I am poor. Maybe I don't deserve happiness. Maybe I do deserve depravity. It's this idea that since they're labeled, they start to think that way.
Yeah, we've talked about this before because I think I brought up last time the movie Trading Places, old movie from back in the 80s, where if you're put in a certain situation, you will behave or perform a certain way. That idea that if you don't know any better, then what will you do?
And it's kind of like, I don't know, maybe it's romantic, but I just watched It's a Wonderful Life this past weekend, and they have like that. It's a very Christmas theme, but there's that quote that says, "No man is a failure who has friends." Right? It's brought up at the end, and it gets to me every time. Like the man who suffered his entire life, who does nothing but give. And you see just the heartbreak in James Stewart's face as he acts. I'm talking about the movie, of course, not Perfect Gift, like the book. But the fact that everybody sees it and recognizes it, but doesn't really show it until the very end is just truly magical, right? And here is Trotty and his daughter, and even Richard to a certain extent, they've got a relationship. Right, like you gotta like love the way that they interact with each other. They joke with each other. Tripe, who brings tripe? You know, right? But when the rich people come in, well, they view it as like the lowest form of economic standard, and like it instantly gets transformed from this relational to a transactional relationship. Which I think can be problematic when you view the world 100% materialistic and 100% monetary. It takes away some of the magic that comes from relationships, that comes from the people and stuff that we have that can't be measured the way that money can.
I wonder, why is it that, because money is an innate object, right? But a lot of times when we read these stories, money always comes out to be viewed as sort of, I hate to give it this word or attribute, is almost evil, or money oftentimes seems to bring out the worst in us. And that just is interesting to me. And maybe that's the point all these authors are trying to make to us, is that money matters less than anything else, but we give it the most value, and that maybe we shouldn't. That family is what is the most important thing.
Well, I think I give you credit, sir, because you pointed this out to me where you said when you're young and when you're, we'll say old, like when you're retired and you're like, this is the end, you're not working anymore, money means the least to you. Children haven't discovered the value of it, right? They just care about the friendships and playing and having the toys and stuff like that. And when you're retired, you've got, hopefully, and not everybody's blessed, but you've got the money to retire, but hopefully you can't buy back your time. Time is the new and most important thing to you, and time with your family and friends tends to be the thing that's prioritized over that money, right? It's only when you're in that hustle and bustle in the middle age, you become obsessed with the materialism and the idea of this is what I need to buy better X or better Y. Whatever that X or Y is for you is typically what you define, but money is the avenue to which you use to achieve that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that eventually many of us in our middle age, we have that crisis that, oh my gosh, like moment. And then you spend a large chunk of your money and you buy a car or you go on a trip or whatever. And then you realize it didn't fill that void and it didn't make a difference like you thought it would. And crisis averted. Now you realize and you start to move towards, I think, what is, more important to many people is their family and friends and that precious gift of time. And, I'll be like, hey, my wife and family is more important than anything, and I will sacrifice making money if I get to have more time and go spend and see a movie with my niece, or get to go to dinner with my wife, or play games with my friends, or record videos with my best friend. Like, that's more important than anything that I could make.
Yeah. All right, so let's kind of talk about the story a little bit more. So moving past this immediate juxtaposition, right, between the super poor and the super rich, we have to deliver a message from him, the Alderman Cute, to, I think it was Mr. Browley, right? We go to see him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I don't know how much you gathered from this, but I thought it was kind of interesting the way that he's like that, the Lannisters, right? Like, I always pay my debts. Like,
okay. I see where you're going.
But it's well, do you? Because I don't know if I have the strongest take here, but the idea that like we turn around to look at Trotty, who's racked up debt, right? Like, he was Miss Chicken Stalker. Oh my gosh, these names.
The story is funny. You got to admit that. Side note, the story is really funny.
These names got me. These names got me.
Yeah.
And he owes Miss Chicken Stalker money, and I don't know where you went with this, but it made me think about like that Christian ideal of by the sweat of my brow. Like, I should be working hard, and, you know, you should ideally be paying off your debts and that sort of thing. There's a little bit of like that Christian method in there, but at the same time, Dickens brings some charm to it as well. I thought, like, it didn't feel, some authors can make it feel very obvious what they're going for. This felt more subtle, and I thought it was kind of funny the way he even poked fun at it, the way that like you might fall asleep at church, they mentioned in like the opening paragraphs and stuff like that. It made me chuckle, because I grew up Catholic. Everybody knows about that church nod. but
Yeah.
there's a certain element to how the Christian sweat of my brow, work until I can't work anymore. I mean, to your point, he's 60 plus years old, running around town. Like, the man has put in his years and has earned his keep, but at the same time, he's still down on his luck.
But he hasn't given up. That's the thing, is he's persevering. And it's when other people tell him that he's in such a terrible position, that's when he starts to question himself. And that's where we get to kind of the crux of the story is like, he gets to that point of like, why did I do all this? What was the point of all this? I feel like he feels like a failure, and that's just like heartbreaking, because he did nothing wrong. He did everything he was supposed to, and he still ends up in this position, and he's still ridiculed on top of it after that. And that's what's just so heartbreaking. We move towards, I think, the final point of the story.
Yeah. Well, I think, and we're going to get there, but real quick, just to throw in like that Will Fern situation, I think that reinforces that idea too, because he didn't want to be seen as a vagrant, right? Like, he wanted to be a hard worker as well. And, you know, Trotty, being a good person, is like, well, don't go tell Alderman Cute or whatever. Like, they're going to arrest you, my man. And eventually, you know, you see the labeling theory come through on Meg, where she's like, well, maybe I shouldn't marry Richard, right? All the way up to the Chimes, right? And I want to get your thoughts on this one too, because the Chimes is where we're drawn to the church, right? So again, we're drawn to religion. We're drawn to an answer, quote unquote. Trotty heads up to the towers, and that's where he has, just like Christmas Carol, this vision of ghosts, right? Very Victorian to have ghosts show you the future, the past, right? But how did you take it? Because one of the things that I kind of wrote down, not to be negative, but at the same time, I'm like, it was very, I like a show don't tell approach. Many readers do. But sometimes, like, what the goblins were doing were just straight up telling you how you should feel, or telling you things. That's not that they weren't showing things, but it just wasn't as sharp or as compelling, I felt like, as some of his other writings, aka A Christmas Carol, with how they pulled that off. How did you interpret or take the goblins, essentially?
They are a little direct. And I think that for this story, I liked that. Some stories I want it to be, you know, vague. I enjoy what my own imagination comes up with. But for here, I think because Trotty has been so forthright through the whole story, it only kind of made sense thematically that we wouldn't leave this kind of, you know, like in Christmas Carol. I know we keep referring back to that, but it's so easy to, is that the ghosts in that were very open to interpretation, right? Of what the spirits were showing and what the spirits were doing. Here, the goblins, you know, basically exactly show Trotty what would happen to his daughter, his son-in-law, and his family. You know, this is what's going to happen. And I like that. I think that it gave me a direct line to Trotty himself. There was no guesswork. And sometimes that's an easier read per se, and I was okay with that in this case.
Well, it's kind of like the It's a Wonderful Life story. I thought there's actually more comparisons to It's a Wonderful Life even than necessarily a Christmas Carol, because you had how one man's influence his power doesn't necessarily always come from money, right? The way that Alderman Cute might think so. But it's also in his relationships that he builds, in the guidance that he gives his daughter, to the point where, his daughter and Richard have that issue. Richard becomes an alcoholic because he's not there to save them, essentially. It's very close to It's a Wonderful Life with Mr. Gower, right? If we weren't there to stop Mr. Gower from making a mistake and thus losing his job and becoming an alcoholic, you see how the good you can create doesn't necessarily always equate to a monetary gain, but can create a communal improvement, right? And when the Mr. Gowers can be the pharmacists, and you have the Nicks running, the bar at Martinis and stuff like that, you see how a community can band together. And I think you mentioned, actually, in a story we recorded earlier tonight, we were talking about what does Christmas mean, right? Even though this is a New Year story, this is always listed in Dickens's Christmas stories. You mentioned Christmas is about community, right? You said something to that effect. And I think that the Goblins do tell that story pretty well, that community matters, and communities are made up of what? Of individuals, right? So to take one individual out, that might completely change what that community is. And you can see your value there if you're given the gift of seeing if you had never been born, that things can actually have been quite different than what you ultimately view maybe yourself as worthless is quite different when you put it in the context of the web of other people.
You got to zoom out, right? I mean, there is the community of, however big you want to go, country, state, blah, blah, blah. But most of us, as we talked about many times before, is your family, your nuclear family, mom, dad, whatever. And then out from there a little bit. And then maybe your neighborhood, and then your school or your church or your YMCA or your sports team. And you influence all of those people in those communities. And then obviously you have the biggest influence in your family, but, even just a smile to someone, can change their whole day. And I know that, for many years I was a teacher, and I always question myself, did I make a difference? And I have that wonderful life moment of, God, I gave 18 years of my life to teaching. What do I have to show for it? A tiny little pension in the end. But then, if I zoom out and I see, maybe I saved one person's life by being kind to them, or maybe somebody else became a teacher because of me and they made someone else's life better because of that. And it has that ripple effect. And I think that it takes a wider perspective, and it takes some soul searching for that to happen. And I think that Trotty finally has that. And that's one of the valuable lessons and the power that Dickens gives to us in these stories.
Right. So how do you wrap that up, right? Like there's a lot there, right? You've got free will in how we choose to be. Right. Our interactions with others is a choice. Right. And I don't think the argument is that we're born bad, or that money causes evil even, or that lack of money causes depravity, thus evil. I don't think it's that story. I think it's opportunity. And I think it's a choice that we have. And I think that choice matters because it shows how you can influence others and keep others from being the worst them, but help them to be the best them. And I think it's that interconnectedness. Right? Like that's what truly matters, more so than just money. Money by itself does not cause happiness. Money by itself does not cause depravity. It's those choices that we make in helping each other to form a more cohesive unit and community, more so than anything else.
And just because you're poor doesn't mean that you can't be good and do good. And just because you're rich doesn't mean that you're going to be bad, and vice versa. Yeah, I think that's perfectly said.
I think I enjoyed this talk probably more than I thought. Like, it's coming off that I enjoyed the book. Like, I enjoyed the book, but I feel like Charlie, he spins a good yarn. This wasn't my favorite of his, but like the elements are there, right? Like those themes matter and they're important. And it's only once you really kind of like start to drive into them did I really even get the most value out of this story. You know what I mean? So it's like,
yeah.
It's like I wasn't like, yeah, this is the best story when I was reading it, but now as we sit here and talk about it, I'm actually getting a little bit more excited. Like maybe like a second read, I'd be even like more excited. It's to your earlier point. It's almost impossible not to compare it to A Christmas Carol. Virginia Woolf herself said that it's a story that you're born knowing, right? The Chimes is a lot harder to articulate, but it's probably just as important. And it's one of those stories that I get. This was my first exposure, unless you count Christmas Carol and It's a Wonderful Life. But I think if I were forced to like read this every single year, I'd probably start to see more and more charm out of it. I'd be more and more open to it because it is an important story, I think.
I think you'd be more like Trotty.
All right, everyone. Thanks for your time today. Let us know what you thought of this story. Where does it rank on Charles Dickens' Christmas stories? And let us know which one you think we should read next. Playlist down below. Peace.
Be kind to yourself. Peace.